Hi, I'm Danny and this is my video on Oligopoly. We're about halfway through Unit 3 now, and this is the last of the big sort of market ones. I think we're going to competition policy next. Oligopoly is basically when there's a few large firms fighting for the majority of the market share. So an example of this would be the supermarket, where there's four big dominant firms, although Aldi and Lidl have risen quite fast. Electricity market's another oligopoly. And you can sort of show how the oligopoly functions using the concentration ratio, which shows the proportion of the market share held by dominant firms. So you'd say, for example, 6:70, which would mean that 6 large firms held 70% of the market share, or 7:90, which would mean that 7 large firms had 90% of the market share. When you've got an oligopoly situation, there are often barriers to entry to prevent new firms from coming in, so the oligopoly and the firms within it maintain their strong position. An example of this is predatory pricing. So an oligopoly has got enough profits in reserve, enough power that they can set a price that would bankrupt competitor firms. So they might set a price that will lose them a bit of money, but they can afford that little bit of money they lose, whereas a competitor firm would just be totally wiped out because they're a lot smaller. Advertising. A large firm has a large output, so say they're producing 20 of something a year, whereas a smaller firm's only producing 4 of something. If they both spend the same amount of money, they get the same amount of advertising, but the average cost is a lot smaller for the larger firm because they're producing more. Multiplicity of brands. Basically, some customers regularly switch brands, so you might say for a few weeks you'll go with one type of perfume, and then you'll change to another type of perfume. And large firms can afford to run multiple brands, so the consumers will switch between brands owned by one large firm, so they can pick up more brand switching customers than a smaller firm, which can probably only afford to have sort of one brand going on. The next one is integration, so combining with other firms. Obviously, large firms are more attractive to combine with, because then you form one very, very large firm with massive market share, whereas if you combine with a very small firm, you're not going to massively increase your market share at all. So if you've got one large firm that's sort of been integrated from a couple of smaller firms, it can control the supply of resources and distribution, and it can benefit from economies of scale, whereas if 2 smaller firms come together, probably not going to have that many benefits for them. Non-price competition. Techniques which persuade customers to buy, so non-price sort of things. These are more affordable for large firms. They can afford to give free stuff out in cereal. Remember when they used to give free stuff in cereal? Those were the days. I loved those days. And when they used to give free Andrex puppies with toilet paper. We bought Andrex especially. And that's what they did. They got us in by giving us the free puppies, whereas smaller toilet companies wouldn't have been able to do that. Branding. Branding makes demand more inelastic because you sort of become attached to a particular brand. And this is again much more affordable for larger companies. They can build up a very strong brand like Heinz with the baked beans. I mean, you don't think of many other baked beans apart from Heinz, whereas a smaller company really can't afford to get that brand out there. And finally, research and development. Larger firms can afford more research and development, so they become more dynamically efficient than smaller firms. And they can have more efficient production techniques, more innovation, more invention, that sort of thing. Here are a few quick definitions to do with competitive oligopoly, which is when the large firms are competing against each other trying to get the most customers rather than colluding to gain maximum sort of profits. So interdependence is when the actions taken by one firm have an impact on the revenues of another firm. So say you put down your prices, you're probably going to take some of my customers and my revenue is going to fall. Reactive behaviour is action taken by firms in response to a changing competitor. So you put down your prices, I'm like, nah, you're not taking my customers, so I put down my prices as well. And brand loyalty is basically a measure indicating the degree of consumer loyalty. So if you've got more brand loyalty, you've got more inelastic supply, because consumers are much less likely to switch to another company because they're hooked on your company regardless of the prices you're sort of putting out there. Price war! That drawing is really terrible, I'm sorry. I'm not going to tell you who it's meant to be. It's based on Class Wars, and hopefully you'll get that bit of banter there. You probably won't recognise him, but if you do, let me know. Basically, a price war is when firms competitively lower their prices in order to increase market share. So one firm will lower their price to increase market share, and other firms will think, well, they're not going to take my market share, so they'll lower their prices as well. And it means that everyone sees decreased revenues even if output remains the same. So it's great for consumers, not so good for the firms. We'll look at this a bit more later, especially with a look at the Nash equilibrium. Here we have the kinked demand curve. Basically, the kinked demand curve is an analysis of reasons for eventual oligopoly price stability. So eventually prices in an oligopoly will tend towards Y. And it's because if they put the prices up, because demand's elastic above Y, there'll be a loss of revenue. And if they put the prices down, they'll lose revenue because there'll be a price war. So they leave their prices at Y where it's stable. Here is the DMRC, which is the discontinuous marginal revenue curve, basically the region over which a change in marginal costs will not lead to a change in output or price. And you can draw it because if you draw the marginal revenue curves of each of the two sort of demand curves here, obviously there's two different elasticities, so they're at different angles, different gradients, and your marginal revenue curves will be different gradients too. You'll find that there's an area here where there's sort of no change in marginal revenue, despite there being a change in revenue and costs. So basically, a firm will attempt to reduce its marginal cost to be as low as possible. So say they were originally at MC2, they're going to try their hardest to push them down to MC1, because this is going to increase their profits. There's a lot of issues with this theory actually though, and actually a lot of people don't study it at school because teachers don't really like it, they think it's a bit outdated and that sort of thing. A main issue with it is there's no really explanation for how the original price was reached. We don't explain price determination at all here. It only deals with price competition and not non-price competition, so it doesn't take that into account at all. Ignores the effects of limited price competition, which is sort of discounts, interest-free credit, that sort of thing. It also assumes a reaction by competing firms, and there's no guarantee they'll actually have a price war if you put the price down. It just assumes that's going to be the case, which is why there's stability. Whereas for a lot of companies in oligopoly situations, prices do keep falling, even though it's not necessarily beneficial for any of the firms to act in this way. And finally, large or strong firms may ignore the model and still lower the price beyond the kink because they know that they can survive lowering the price, whereas others can't, so they might deliberately lower the price in order to force other firms out of the market. Let's take a look at game theory now. Game theory is basically the analysis of how a game's players react to changing circumstances. And if you've got a zero-sum game, it basically means that the gain by one player is matched by a loss by another player. So say I'm making £10 of profit and you're making £10 of profit, and then suddenly I have an extra £5 of profit. If we have a zero-sum game, you're making £10 less £5 profit. So you're making £5 profit and I'm making £15 profit. That's a zero-sum game. Risk adverse means that no party will take an action that will promote retaliatory activity. So say we've both got our prices at £15 for a unit. I'm not going to put my price down because I know that you're going to do the same. So then we'll be risk adverse. Game theory competing. The Nash equilibrium is basically when a firm's best strategy is to maintain its present behaviour given the behaviour of other firms. If anyone's seen A Beautiful Mind, that's a film all about John Nash. Nash actually died on Saturday in a taxi accident, so that's quite sad. So it's an appropriate time to sort of do it, possibly not. But John Nash was a really great mathematician and a very interesting person. Basically, the prisoner's dilemma is the one we're going to look at here. So basically, if A does their best, if they increase their output to more than B without B changing. So if I increase my output and you don't, that's the best situation for me. But because we're both going to be worried that the other party will make more profit, we're going to both increase our output. So it might be best for both of us to maintain our output at the same level, but because we know if the other person increases their output and we don't, we're going to lose a lot of money. We both increase our output because we're both worried, which means that we both lose out in the end. This is called the optimal preventative strategy, and it's the sort of non-cooperative equilibrium, the Nash equilibrium. And basically what this model shows is that both firms benefit from colluding rather than competing. That's why we're now looking at colluding, which is when firms cooperate in pricing and output policies. So in a formal collusion, firms are going to ensure that marginal cost equal marginal revenue, because obviously that's the place at which we're going to have the most profit. Formal collusions tend to be illegal because they go against competition policy, because, for example, a cartel might agree to keep prices high and have output low, because that's going to maximise the profits they can make. Actually, my old school, the junior school, they were getting it redone, and the builders that were rebuilding it were actually members of a cartel, which obviously put the price up quite a bit for our school. So that was unfortunate, and probably totally irrelevant, actually. But basically a cartel is going to make restrictive agreements in order to increase joint profits, and here are a lot of conditions cartels tend to have. So all major producers must be cartel members, otherwise if you've got another producer who can just suddenly cut the price, it's going to kind of ruin the effect for you if you want to have high prices for everyone. Markets should be isolated from suppliers outside of cartels. Same thing really, basically want everybody to be in the cartel, that's the best place for us. High barriers to entry to prevent competition. We don't want any new firms coming in to try to cream off all of our supernormal profits. All producers must agree not to defect. Obviously it's not going to be much fun if we've all got a cartel going on and then Bobby in the corner decides to suddenly cut his prices. That wouldn't work out at all. And cartels that are selling homogeneous products have more success because they're all the same. Otherwise there's going to be less sort of competition in the first place for this collusion to wipe out. It actually leads to more non-price competition actually, because if consumers can't choose on price, they're going to look for other things. So a lot of cartels, whilst they are putting up price, they might actually increase quality as well, because they're all competing on non-price things too. Tends to be increased profits for the cartel members, that's why they're doing it, particularly the case for inelastic products, because they're not going to see a major fall in demand in response to these increased prices. And another good thing that could happen for consumers is that higher prices lead to higher profits, which leads to more investment. So that could be good, lead to more dynamic efficiency, newer products, that sort of thing. On the other hand, because prices are higher, the price of products made using the original product could rise as well. So say there's a sheep cartel selling wool. If they raise the price of wool, chances are that woolly jumpers are going to raise in price as well. That's really unrealistic example. Oil would probably have been the one to go for. Informal collusion basically occurs when a price leader establishes the market price that all the other firms follow, because they don't want to lose out on profits, so they all try to stick together. And it can be quite hard for a competition commission or someone like that to work out whether there's actually price leadership or whether there's an official sort of collusion going on. The bottom one there, tacit collusion, is basically when firms reach an agreement over pricing, so that can be quite dubious if they're all agreeing to keep their prices at a certain level. Probably a cartel going on there. The one above that, parallel pricing, is when there's identical prices and price movements maintained in the industry, so everyone sticks very much together. That's what the train track's doing, because they've got parallel lines. And perpendicular lines too. Exciting stuff. Or it could be a ladder to success. It looks a bit more like a ladder. A really dodgy ladder. Weird gaps between the rungs. Anyway, barometric price leadership is because smaller firms tend to be sort of better in tune to what the market's going for than big firms, because big firms can maintain quite high prices without really noticing any difference in profit and that sort of thing. Small firms' prices tend to be accepted because they're adroit to interpreting market conditions, so smaller firms tend to be more in tune with what the market wants. So that would be barometric price leadership if we put price leadership in the hands of a smaller firm. Obviously you don't want it to be too small, but that is sort of relatively small firm that's in touch with the consumers. And the other one is dominant firm leadership, which is probably the main one here, which is when a dominant firm in the industry changes the price and all the other firms follow. So say you've got the big price in the industry and you suddenly put your price up £10, I'm going to sit here and think, yes, I'm going to put up my price too. If it was exactly the same price I was putting it up, that would be parallel pricing. If I just put up my price because you've put up your price, that's dominant firm leadership. Woo, the final slide, and my voice is celebrating, so I really can't keep going for much longer. Here are some pricing techniques. There's two forms of pricing that are very, very common in oligopoly. One of them is transfer pricing, which is basically when MNCs alter their costs and prices to benefit from different tax levels in different countries. So you're going to overstate your costs in high tax countries and then sell your products in subsidiaries cheaply. So you'll sell your products in low tax countries and state your costs in high tax countries. So you're declaring your profits in your low tax countries and you're stating your costs in your high tax countries. So that's going to be sort of balancing it out and essentially minimising the tax bill, and the less tax you pay, obviously the more profits you make. Not sure how this could come up potentially, but it's a good thing to know, I guess. And the other one is cost plus pricing, which is much easier for firms that are on the MES, because basically means that you keep your costs constant. So if your costs are constant between A and B, because you're on your minimum efficient scale, that means that you can change your output anywhere between A and B without having any change in your cost per unit, your average total cost per unit. So then you'll essentially say, that's the cost of production, we're going to put our price maybe £10 above this. So that's cost plus pricing. So that's basically how a lot of oligopolies run, and essentially it's to prevent menu costs. Menu costs are basically the cost of changing your price. So say you're selling bananas at £10, now you're selling them at £20, the cost of just changing the price on the banana can be quite expensive, you know, in advertising and labels and that sort of thing. Much cheaper to do cost plus pricing. Although again, this can be very slow to react to changes in market conditions. Woo! We have made it to the end. Join me next time for stuff on competition policy and I don't know what it is even. Competition policy is the main one, I think. See if it's written down somewhere. Competition policy and contestable markets. Yes, join for that. Hope this video has helped and it didn't go too fast. I felt like it was going a bit too fast, but oh well. Have a lovely day. Hope revision's going fabulously. Goodbye.